What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership in the spotlight. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Prime Minister. Let's get this podcast done. They aim to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make the world work. We discuss everything from the revival of the traditional British pub to the newest Trump golf club, and of course, the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later on in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, the former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course the current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we are joined by Harriet Spalding, Investment Sales Manager at Mandale Group. Established in 1982, the group is a highly experienced property development company specialising in commercial, industrial and residential builds. Based in Stockton-on-Tees, they have become a leading light in the sector in the North East. I discuss with Harriet their successful journey to the present day, their ups and downs along the way, and what the group has planned for the future. Harriet, welcome.
Hi.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today. And I thought it might be a marvellous place to start. It's been a few months, obviously, since Mandale's been in the review. I think the listeners would love to know what you, the team, the group, have been up to since.
Yeah, so we've just got busier, really. So we've completed on a few housing sites, and we've effectively started a few more, to make for the business, I guess. But
wonderful.
Just busy. So it's been a good time of year, really.
Absolutely. And I think what a lot of people might not know is that Mandale obviously was found now in 1982. It's got a fantastic backstory, which begins, funny enough, with snooker and pool, if that's right.
Yeah. So our MD, he actually started recovering pool and snooker tables back in I think it was the 70s, and then started building snooker tables, pool and snooker tables, and they shipped worldwide. But in the 80s, pool and snooker was very popular, and it seemed to dwindle in popularity somewhat. And the money that was being made, the profits from the pool and snooker building business, some of that was actually invested into commercial property. And from there, that's where Mandale started, really. There was one year, the MD, he tells us the story of one year, it was Christmas time, and he looked around the stock room and he had a lot of spare stock of pool and snooker tables, and he knew at that point that the peak of the pool and snooker industry had really been and gone, and it was perhaps time to move on. And that's really how Mandale Group started. It started out as a bit of a side investment in commercial property. It's a really charming story, and if it hadn't been for the decline of snooker and pool, then we might not be speaking today. Quite possibly.
And indeed, of course, especially during the 80s, it was a revolutionary time, especially in the northeast of England. Mrs. Thatcher obviously had her famous walk in the wilderness in Stockton-on-Tees. How did the 80s really shape the company, especially towards the end, and the huge investment projects that were embarked on?
Yeah, so I don't know if you're aware, if any of the listeners are aware, but a bit of a famous picture that goes around the north of Margaret Thatcher walking through effectively a wilderness, and that is now known as Teesdale Business Park, and it's an old dockland, and it was effectively wilderness. And she walked across there and created almost, well, it was called Teesside Development Corporation, what she effectively created, and she put in a lot of funds, and through what was known as the TDC, there was a lot of development on this derelict land, and through collaboration with the TDC, we actually built a couple of 100,000 square foot of offices on that old land. We subsequently sold all that, but that's where a lot of our commercial development started. It was started in collaboration with the Teesside Development Corporation. One of the biggest projects we did, I mean, this went on for quite a few years. We actually took ownership of Hartlepool Marina, which at the time was old industrial. It was a bit quiet. They wanted a bit of regeneration and a bit more of the social atmosphere down there. They wanted some housing, and they wanted to see it brought back to life, really. And we took ownership of Hartlepool Marina, and we did a huge redevelopment. In our office, we've got a fantastic picture. We've got a picture of the Hartlepool docks from the 1800s, and then we've got one that we got taken by a professional photographer in the early 2000s, and the difference is just staggering. So a lot of that wasteland we took and we developed into apartments. There was several apartment blocks down there, and we also built an esplanade of shops. It's a thriving social hub today. A lot of people that live in the area, they actually head down to Hartlepool for a few drinks and a meal on a night out.
Yeah, and I think, as you're completely right, Howard, I should point out for those that might be unfamiliar, to call Hartlepool Marina thriving could be an understatement. It really is a wonderful social area.
Well, it really is.
Yes.
It's a place that people almost make a beeline for, if you like. If they fancy going somewhere different, they head down to Hartlepool. And it's by the sea and in the sun, in the summer, in the sun and the warmth. It's lovely sitting out there.
And I imagine also even in the cold as well.
Even in the cold, yes. It's not too bad, to be fair. They now have annual events there. The Tall Ships was there probably about 10 years ago now. We had the Tall Ships regatta. They had a weekend up at Hartlepool Marina.
Excellent.
That was fantastic for the area. But also as well, the management of the marina itself, we didn't manage that, but we passed on that management, and they do wild water swimming, kayaking, sailing, and all sorts in the actual marina as well now. So it's a fantastic place. There's plenty for all the family to do down there.
Now, obviously, it's a fantastic transformative story that really couldn't have. It's fantastic that Mandale can be a significant part of that. But that's not to say there hasn't been hiccups and challenges along the way. It feels like sometimes a lifetime ago now, but in 2008, obviously, the financial crash, it very much, in a way, Harriet, made the company sort of reshape itself. How did the group survive those challenges, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, it actually really did change our. We had to diversify. It changed the property landscape in the north quite significantly. Before the recession, we were doing a lot of apartment blocks, new build apartment blocks, and we did 250 unit site on the Quayside. We had them all over. We had some in Sheffield, some in Leeds. We built student blocks, and all of those blocks. A lot of those blocks were actually pre-sold before we even, not before we started construction, but before we got to completion. A lot of the units were sold because the property market was that hot, and we had in the pipeline we had land earmarked for future apartment development, but when the recession actually came, I don't know if you remember, but the apartment market in the Northeast, it died overnight, and it was just such a snap change. It was phenomenal, really. And what it meant was a lot of the land that we had earmarked for development of apartments, we actually restructured, and we either sold it or we transformed some of the planning permissions on there from apartments to houses. And that's where our larger scale house building came into the picture. We always built houses, and we did barn conversions and smaller developments of 4, 5, 6, sometimes up to 12 unit developments, but nothing on the scale that we're doing now. But our hands were almost forced in that because of the way the market switched, and it left us effectively. It left us with no other choice, really.
Yes. But
it was not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it set us up. Certainly now we feel a lot more. I think looking back, hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Quite, yes.
But looking back, I think we should have known that it was a bit overheated, and we should have potentially seen the warning signs and known that it was, it was never going to last forever, if you like. Whereas with housing now, we feel in a position where we're a lot more sustainable as a business, and we can continue going forward for many years, and we don't feel quite as exposed to the marketplace as we used to, I don't think.
I think it is a superb example, Harriet, of a company, indeed any organisation, being able to pinpoint the problem, being able to sort out a plan to get through it and thrive on the other end. And it's a great example of how you're raising standards by having a huge and significant challenge that everyone went through. A lot of firms didn't come out the other end, but you came out flying. Now, stepping back actually from Mandale slightly here, Harriet, as you see the market as things are today, what would you identify, especially in the Northeast, as the medium-term challenges you're facing?
I think there's a few challenges. I think, obviously, there's a well-documented housing crisis, which I don't think that we potentially feel in the north quite like we do in the south. I think one of the biggest discussions around that, which is a very, very valid discussion, is a lot more people want to live in the south. So actually committing to building the homes in the areas that they're desperately needed is a lot more difficult, I think, in the south than it is in the north to a certain extent. But so I don't think we're in a position where don't get me wrong, there is a housing crisis. I think it's perhaps not quite as acute in the north. But we have our own challenges. A lot of the challenges, revolve around a loss of Help to Buy. We're experiencing a loss of people buying with Help to Buy, and to have that reassurance from the government that wants the Help to Buy as it currently stands is not just going to disappear overnight, it's actually going to change. So the Help to Buy is actually changing now. So rather than being able to lend up to 20% of a £600,000 house, regardless of where you are in the country, it's based on, I don't quite know the exact metrics, but it's based on a percentage above the average house price in the area.
Yes.
Which is a lot more sensible way to do it, because the £600,000 house in the northeast, you can get a really big house in a really nice area for that money. Whereas in London, you'd probably,
one bedroom flat sometimes.
Yeah, you'd probably couldn't buy a flat. So they are very different, and I think that will affect us, because we see a lot of people actually buying houses off us above the level that's been set for the northeast. But I think that's almost an adjustment on the consumer front that we'll feel, rather than an adjustment for us. It probably won't affect our house pricing or anything, because we never, we're very careful with our pricing on site. But it would affect the buyer's attitude to buying, I think. I think we get a lot of first-time buyers who, rather than buying a 2-bed, will buy a 3-bed, because it will last them longer and they can afford it with Help to Buy. Whereas I think that sort of attitude might change slightly when the new Help to Buy limit come in, because it would almost obstruct the purchase of a property that is perhaps not unaffordable, but perhaps more expensive for those people, by pulling them back into a smaller or a less expensive property in order for them to still get that Help to Buy funding.
I think you're spot on, Harriet, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops. And I think, as you hit the nail on the head, and how regionally it will develop differently. I know that obviously we're speaking in the midst of a general election, so that's everybody's Christmas ruined. But the listeners should know, obviously, we're speaking with, less than a week to go. And there have been many promises regarding construction in the housing market in the manifestos. I know one of the more eye-catching ones was the Conservatives' pledge to introduce lifetime fixed-term mortgages. But let's say, Howard, I'll put you on the spot. Let's say you were writing the manifesto for the Mandale Group party, let's say. What would you put in that manifesto that would help the sector grow and become a little more stable over the coming years?
I would say there needs to be help to the first-time buyer market more in order for them to be able to save up for a mortgage. We get a lot of people that are fortunate enough to be able to live with their parents while they save up, but you have a lot of people in a position where they can't live with their parents to save up, and they're paying rent while trying to save for a mortgage, and that's really tough. That's really hard, and it almost takes them longer to buy. I think also as well, there needs to be more housing, especially in the northeast, more housing in more areas. I think we have pockets of house building in the north where you'll drive past an area and there's 3 or 4 developments of a few hundred houses on the same location.
Clustered together.
And then you go to another town. Yeah, clustered together. And I think, for me, that's great. I think a lot of the concerns from the local residents that we come across, maybe not so much now because ours are smaller, but is the infrastructure. So I think, yes, okay, fair enough. Build these houses because people need these houses. People need to be able to afford to buy a house. But there is also a problem with the infrastructure that surrounds it, be it the roads or the schools or the doctors or the hospitals or whatever it might be. And I think that's one of the big concerns. As well for us, it would be to train more trades, would be to encourage apprenticeships in the house building industry. We're experiencing a huge shortage of trades at the minute, bricklayers, electricians and the like. Because during the recession, a lot of them retrained and they went into, the likes of IT or whatever. And now we're out of the recession, I think a lot of them are probably a bit more elderly or whatever and don't quite fancy
to me, Harriet,
physical labour that's involved in laying bricks, I guess.
Well, it rather sounds like quite sensible policies to me. So with any luck, some of those will be adopted because I think, obviously, you're quite right. There needs to be a much more level-headed and practical set of solutions, I think, to the current crisis because thankfully it's not as you've mentioned, acute in the northeast, but one can't help but feel that if nothing is done, things aren't going to get better, are they? No. Now, I'm conscious of the time here, Harriet, so I think we should probably come to a close, and let's do that by returning to Mandale itself. Obviously, it's had an exceptional a few years. What are the plans for the next 18 months or so?
So our plans, we are planning to still continue growing the house building side. We are still developing a business park up in Durham. We're experiencing a lot more demand for hybrid and industrial units up there rather than office space due to the change in I guess, not economic climate, but the working climate where you get a lot more online shops and a lot more flexible working that reduces the demand for office space, high volume office space. But also for us, we do a lot of development or redevelopment of old office buildings in the city centres, brownfield sites. We convert them from, dare I say the word Brexit, it really does depend on Brexit.
Well, I'm glad you said it first. It's a shame, actually, Harriet, because I know we're speaking at certain times, obviously, in the middle of a general election. We don't know what the result of Brexit will be. Perhaps in the new year, come together again and speak with a little more certainty on that front. But that
would be great. It's quite difficult,
yes.
1, 3 and 5 years when you don't quite know what's going to happen economically. But
Harriet,
that would be great.
Well, it's a pleasure chatting to you today, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Harriet, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Mandale are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the country's special envoy for post-Holocaust issues, as well as being a keen vexillologist. That's flags to you and me. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now. Eric, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that, no. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something, and it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on. I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So, as we speak, we don't quite know. As, well, perhaps like the government front bench, don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without making amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40-odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December, something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we were left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, oh no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as you correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you? I mean, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshireman, obviously representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your constituents right now? Hang in there; it'll be all right.
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I've found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want, and I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership.
Well, I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay to be members, and it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow Chairman Lord Blunkett has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
Oh, so I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxists to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I'll join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around, and my family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to it. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed, but I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story. Most people might guess that a dialogue Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I'd Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who, I can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bunk was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, for something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realise that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastic new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the kind of the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down to being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had include some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised, I may imagine you may not be, at some of the backlash towards, in this country, introducing voter ID for voting?
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress it. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to evensong and warband. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
And I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Yeah, absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
I think very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working with and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. but more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you referenced as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because the former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you were quite unscathed from it.
I can't. He was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out 1 or 2 of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time. But I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress, and it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know this is going to be a huge focus of the next review. Well, Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to the Grosvenor to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.